You need to recognize something that often goes unnoticed about empaths. They don't shatter in obvious ways. There's no loud outburst, no clear signal that things have fallen apart. Instead, the shift happens gradually, almost unseen beneath the surface. An empath can spend years taking in the emotional weight of those around them, interpreting pain that isn't theirs, carrying loads they never chose. And because they're naturally inclined to understand, to forgive, to justify behavior, they remain longer than they should. At first, it appears as strength. They're the steady presence in chaos, the listener in every storm, the one who can face discomfort without hesitation. But what most fail to notice is that this constant emotional labor comes with a price. Every boundary overlooked, every feeling dismissed, every time they put someone else's peace above their own, quietly builds up. Not suddenly, but gradually, silently. And this is where the shift begins. The empath starts recognizing a pattern. They give, and it's expected. They understand, and it's taken advantage of. They forgive, and it keeps repeating. What once felt meaningful begins to feel draining. The emotional capacity that once seemed limitless starts shrinking. Conversations feel heavier. Interactions feel one-sided. And for the first time, the empath doesn't just feel others. They begin to feel the weight within themselves. And this is the internal struggle most people never witness. Because on the outside, they still appear steady. They still show up. They still listen. But internally, something is shifting. There's a rising tension between who they've always been and what they're beginning to understand. And that understanding is simple yet deeply unsettling. Being highly understanding doesn't shield you from being deeply hurt. Now, psychologically, this is where emotional overload begins turning into suppression. The empath doesn't suddenly lose their sensitivity. Instead, they start containing it. Rather than expressing pain, they analyze it. Instead of reacting emotionally, they step back and observe. And while that might seem like growth, there's a crucial difference between awareness and avoidance. Because what's happening here isn't healing, it's compression. Think of it as pressure building beneath the surface. Every unspoken frustration, every time they chose silence instead of confrontation, every moment they downplayed their own needs, it doesn't disappear. It gets stored. And eventually, that emotional storage reaches its limit, and this is the breaking point. Not loud, not visible, but decisive. It's the moment when the empath stops asking, "How can I understand them?" and starts asking, "Why am I accepting this?" That change in perspective shifts everything because it redirects focus inward. It forces them to examine not only others' behavior, but their own patterns of tolerance. And here's where it becomes risky, not for others, but for the identity the empath has built for themselves. Because once they see it, they can't ignore it. They notice the imbalance. They recognize where they've been overextending, overgiving, overexplaining. And with that awareness comes a kind of emotional recoil, a pulling back, a need to protect what has gone unprotected for too long. But protection, when it comes from prolonged exposure to harm, doesn't always emerge balanced. It often appears extreme. The same depth that once allowed them to love intensely now allows them to withdraw entirely. The same awareness that helped them connect now helps them detach. And the same emotional intelligence that made them compassionate can begin to make them strategic because they're no longer just feeling emotions. They're managing them. And this is the phase people often describe as dark. But it isn't darkness in the way most assume. It's not evil. It's not malicious. It's the result of an empath reaching a point where continuing as they were is no longer possible. So they adjust. They become more selective, more guarded, less reactive. And while it may appear on the surface that they've become cold, what's really happening is far more layered. They've stopped allowing unlimited access to their emotional space. And for those who once benefited from that openness, this shift feels uncomfortable, even threatening. But from the empath's point of view, it's survival. The unsettling part isn't that the empath changes, it's that the change was necessary. And once that necessity becomes clear, there's no returning to who they used to be. Because the moment an empath realizes that their greatest strength has also been their greatest vulnerability is the moment they stop offering it so freely. And what follows is even more subtle and far more intentional. After that internal turning point, The empath doesn't announce their transformation. There's no confrontation, no dramatic statement that things are different. In fact, to others, it may seem like nothing has changed at all. They're still present, still composed, still engaged in conversation. But if you look closely, there's a quiet shift in how they communicate. They stop explaining. And this matters because explaining used to be their instinct. Empaths naturally try to close gaps in understanding. They clarify intentions, ease tension, and translate emotions so others feel at ease. They overexpress not out of uncertainty, but out of care. They want to be understood. And more importantly, they want others to feel understood. But over time, they begin to see something clearly. Not all misunderstandings are accidental. Some people benefit from misinterpreting you. Some rely on your explanations because it allows them to avoid responsibility. And once an empath recognizes that dynamic, the need to explain starts to fade, and so they stop. Not out of spite, not out of anger, but out of awareness. Instead of correcting every misunderstanding, they allow people to show who they are. Instead of filling every silence, they let it exist. And within that silence, something revealing happens. People begin to say more than they intended. Without guidance, without emotional cushioning, others expose their assumptions, their motives, and their limits. This is where the empath shifts from being involved to simply observing. Now, psychologically, this is a powerful transition because observation creates distance, and distance creates clarity. When you're no longer emotionally entangled in every interaction, you start seeing patterns that were once hidden. You notice contradictions. You pick up on subtle manipulation. You recognize when someone's words don't align with their actions. And for an empath, this realization is profound because their natural ability to read people doesn't fade, it sharpens. But here's the key difference. They're no longer using that ability to bond. They're using it to assess. Every interaction becomes information. Every response is observed. They begin asking quieter, more calculated questions. Is this person consistent? Do their actions reflect their words? What happens when I stop adjusting myself for them? And maybe even more revealing, who do they become when I no longer make interactions easy for them? This is where discomfort starts to surface for others. Because the empath who once softened conversations, absorbed tension, and made emotional space safe is no longer doing that anymore. They are no longer turning discomfort into clarity. They are simply allowing it to remain. And most people are not equipped to sit with that, and you will notice it in small reactions. People become uneasy. They ask, "Why are you acting different?" Or, "Did I do something wrong?" But what they are actually responding to is the removal of something they depended on, the empath carrying emotional responsibility for both sides. Now, there is a deeper psychological shift happening here. When an empath stops explaining themselves, they are not just changing communication style, they are redefining responsibility. They are no longer managing how others interpret them. They are no longer overfunctioning just to preserve comfort. Instead, they allow people to sit with their own interpretations, even if those interpretations are inaccurate. And this can feel uncomfortable, especially for those who are used to constant emotional adjustment. But it is not cruelty, it is clarity. Because real communication is not built on endless clarification, but on shared effort. Once the empath sees they have been carrying disproportionate emotional labor, the imbalance becomes undeniable. So they recalibrate. They speak less but more intentionally. They engage but with limits. They listen but without absorbing everything. And most importantly, they stop managing perception. And this is where their silence becomes impactful. Not avoidance, not emotional withdrawal, but controlled restraint. A silence that removes emotional cushioning and forces reality to surface on its own. It strips away interpretation layers and reveals what people actually bring into the interaction. And that is exactly why this shift feels so unsettling to others. Because the empath is no longer predictable, no longer easily accessible, and no longer emotionally available on demand. And there is a new kind of distance forming, not built from indifference but from awareness. They are still observant, still understanding, still deeply perceptive, but no longer automatically available. That single shift changes everything. Because when an empath stops explaining, They also stop negotiating their worth in every interaction. They stop justifying limits. They stop shrinking clarity to maintain comfort. They allow their presence to stand without explanation. And the people who only connected with the overgiving version of them begin to drift away. Not because they were pushed out, but because the empath stopped pulling them in. That is when it becomes clear. Silence is not emptiness. It is the removal of distortion. And after this stage of silence and observation, something even more subtle begins to develop. Something that doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It does not resemble anger or confrontation. It resembles stillness. This is the phase where the empath who once experienced everything intensely begins to feel differently, not because they have shut down, but because they have adapted. Their system has recalibrated in response to overload, and at one point, their sensitivity was wide open. They could enter a space and instantly detect emotional shifts. They read tone, behavior, silence, and energy patterns almost automatically. They absorbed not just words but emotional undercurrents. But that level of openness without protection cannot sustain itself indefinitely. So the mind adapts. It protects. And one of its most effective protections is emotional detachment. And detachment is often misunderstood as coldness or indifference, but in reality it is regulation. It is the nervous system reducing unnecessary exposure. The empath does not stop understanding people. They stop absorbing them. And that difference is essential. Outwardly, they may appear unchanged. They still listen, still respond, still engage. But internally, something fundamental has shifted, and there is now a boundary where there was once none. Emotional input is no longer automatic, it is filtered. They pause more. They react less. Situations that once triggered immediate emotional engagement now meet stillness instead. They do not rush to fix, explain, or absorb. They assess first. And for those around them, this change feels unfamiliar. The warmth, urgency, and emotional availability they once knew is now replaced with space and restraint. And you may hear comments like, "You've changed," or "You don't care anymore." But what they are really noticing is not absence of care, it is absence of overextension. And this is where the shift becomes psychologically deeper. Because detachment formed after emotional exhaustion does not always feel like peace. Sometimes it feels like distance, even emptiness. And a quiet question begins to emerge internally. Why don't I feel the same anymore? For someone who built identity around emotional depth, that question can feel unsettling. But the truth is not that emotion is gone. It is that unlimited emotional access has ended. And that is a very different reality. And philosophically, this becomes a turning point. The empath begins to redefine connection itself. Is connection about absorbing everything another person brings, or is it about remaining present without self-erasure? For most of their life, they believed depth required immersion. That to understand someone fully, they had to feel everything with them. But now they begin to see the cost of that belief, and constant emotional merging blurs identity. It makes it difficult to distinguish between what belongs to them and what belongs to others. Over time, that confusion leads to exhaustion. So they adjust. They remain aware but no longer entangled. They can recognize emotion without carrying it. They can witness intensity without absorbing it. They can be present without being consumed. And from the outside, this creates a different presence entirely. Quieter, more grounded, less reactive. Not absent, but no longer available in the same unrestricted way as before. Pulled in every direction by external emotional pressures. For some people, this shift feels uncomfortable because when someone is no longer emotionally reactive, they become significantly harder to control. Usual approaches like guilt, urgency, or emotional pressure lose their effectiveness. The empath is no longer responding from instinct. They are responding from deliberate choice. And choice introduces control into the dynamic. But there is also a less discussed side to this stage. Because while detachment offers protection, it can also create isolation. If it becomes excessive, it may distance the empath not only from harmful environments, but also from meaningful connections. That is the delicate balance they must manage. How to remain open without becoming exposed. How to stay connected without losing independence. How to feel deeply without being consumed by emotion. There is no fixed solution for this. It is an ongoing adjustment. And what remains clear is this: the empath at this stage is no longer operating from their earlier emotional framework. They are no longer driven by the need to be needed, the compulsion to fix others, or the habit of overgiving. They have entered a different state of functioning, one that appears calmer externally, but is far more deliberate internally. And for those who once understood them only through emotional availability, this version can feel unfamiliar, even unsettling. Yet it is not loss, it is refinement. And because the empath has not stopped feeling, they have simply learned that not every emotional input requires full absorption. And once this stage is reached, after overload, silence, and detachment, something emerges that is often misunderstood. From the outside, it may look like transformation into something entirely different, but internally, it is not chaos, it is structure, it is clarity, and the empath does not lose their ability to understand people. In fact, that ability often becomes sharper. The difference is that it is no longer automatic, it is intentional. Earlier in their journey, awareness was instinctive. They would enter a space and immediately register emotional states: who was uneasy, who was distressed, who needed support. Their attention constantly moved outward, adjusting in real time. It was almost reflexive. And now that same awareness remains, but it is directed differently. The question is no longer, how do I help this person feel better, but rather, what is actually happening here? That shift from emotional participation to analytical observation is where their internal power consolidates. They begin recognizing patterns rather than isolated moments. They observe consistency, behavioral repetition, and underlying tendencies instead of reacting to surface emotion. And this is where the concept sometimes referred to as a dark empath begins to surface. Not because the person becomes harmful, but because they become aware without immediate emotional merging. That distinction is critical. Pure compassion is open and automatic. But after being repeatedly misused, it becomes selective. And selectivity introduces structure into empathy. And from here, two possible paths emerge. On one side, this awareness becomes a protective mechanism. The empath uses it to establish boundaries, avoid manipulation, and engage only where mutual respect exists. Their energy becomes measured and intentional. On the other side, that same awareness can evolve into influence. Because once you understand emotional patterns, you also understand behavioral triggers. You recognize timing, response patterns, and psychological leverage points, and this is where people begin to feel uneasy. Because the empath who once appeared emotionally transparent is now observably reserved. Their responses are no longer predictable. There is a layer of restraint that was not present before. You can no longer assume their reaction because they are no longer reacting automatically. They are choosing. And most people operate through impulse, habit, and emotional reflex. Their responses are often immediate, shaped by feeling rather than observation. The empath at this stage is no longer in that mode. They observe first, evaluate second, respond last. That space between stimulus and reaction becomes the space where control exists. And once someone learns to live in that space consistently, their presence fundamentally changes. And they become less vulnerable to pressure, less influenced by emotional escalation, and less predictable in their responses. Not because they are detached from reality, but because they are no longer emotionally accessible in the same unrestricted way. Their awareness now includes pause, evaluation, and choice. And philosophically, this introduces a deeper question. What responsibility comes with awareness? Because awareness itself is neutral. It does not dictate action. It simply expands possibility. The same insight that allows deep understanding can also allow subtle influence. The same emotional reading ability that builds connection can also be used for strategic awareness. So the empath is faced with a quiet internal decision. And do they use this clarity to strengthen boundaries and build healthier connections? Or do they use it to influence outcomes in subtle ways? That decision becomes the defining factor in what this transformation ultimately becomes. And regardless of direction, one truth remains constant. The empath is no longer operating from naivety. They no longer assume intent without evidence. They no longer ignore inconsistency for the sake of harmony. They no longer grant unlimited access to their emotional world. They have learned that empathy without boundaries is not kindness. It is self-erasure. And so their empathy becomes structured. It becomes intentional. It becomes selective. It is no longer given automatically, but offered consciously. And for those who were accustomed to the earlier version of them, the one who explained everything, absorbed everything, and overgave emotionally, this version can feel unsettling because it removes imbalance. It removes emotional advantage. It replaces accessibility with sovereignty. And in sovereignty, by nature, cannot be easily influenced. That is why this stage is often misunderstood. Not because it is negative, but because it is no longer convenient for those who benefited from emotional excess. The empath has not lost depth. They have not lost awareness. They have not lost compassion. They have integrated all of it with discernment. And that integration creates a different kind of strength. Not reactive strength, but chosen strength. Not emotional overflow, but emotional direction. Because now they are not simply someone who feels deeply. They are someone who decides carefully. And in that decision lies the final evolution of their transformation.